middle anymore. We're nearing the end of our study of John. By now you're well aware that the theme of John is believe, and we get that from John chapter 20, where John says that Jesus did other things. He said other things, but that John intentionally selected what he wrote in order that we might come to belief and continue in belief. Excuse me. So we always ask the question, what is it that John wants us to see? Because he could have written about something else. Could have written about something else that Jesus did, something else that Jesus said, but he intentionally recorded this because he thought that it would be important for us to believe. Today we're going to finish up John chapter 19 and then move into John chapter 20. If you recall, back in John chapter 19, Jesus has been crucified. And he has died. He said, it's finished. And that's where we pick up in John chapter 19, if I can get somebody to read verses 38 through 42.
After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it to the linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was closed at hand, they laid Jesus there.
All right, thank you. Who is Joseph of Arimathea? What does John tell us about him?
Fear of Jews. Disciple of Jesus and fear of Jews.
Okay, he's a Pharisee and he is a disciple of Jesus. What kind of disciple is he? Okay, he's a secret disciple. Now, Joseph comes and asks for the body of Jesus, but he doesn't come by himself. John's the only one that I'm aware of who records that Joseph comes, but not by himself. Who comes with Joseph? Okay, Nicodemus. Okay, both members of the Sanhedrin. Where have we encountered Nicodemus before? Anybody remember? Where have we encountered Nicodemus before? Miss Lentz, I think you got it. What'd you say?
I just was saying to Tim, I think he was in the hierarchy of the priests.
He is. He's a Pharisee and a member of the Sanhedrin. We've encountered him before in John. Do you remember where we've encountered him? It was really early in John, like John chapter 3. Nicodemus comes to Jesus and he asks a question. He asks, basically, who are you and everything, and Jesus starts to talk with him, and very quickly Jesus expresses that to be his disciple you need to be born again. To which Nicodemus asks the question that most of us remember somebody asking, well, how am I supposed to be born again? Can I really enter into the womb a second time as a full-grown man? And Jesus expresses, no, you have to be born of water and the Spirit. And man, if you don't even understand this, how are you going to understand everything else? That's Nicodemus. Now, it's interesting that Nicodemus in John chapter 3 comes by night. And John makes a pretty big deal about him coming by night. Now, there could be a variety of reasons as to why he chooses to come by night. But John makes a big deal about it there. And here he says that earlier Nicodemus had come by night. Why? Why include that little detail with regards to earlier Nicodemus had come by night? Well, if you remember, John likes to use light and dark. Rami, what does light represent? What is light? When John talks in terms of light, what is he talking about? Say again? Okay, knowledge, specifically knowledge of whom? knowledge of God. In him was light, no darkness. Later in 1 John, it'll be even more obvious with the idea of if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, because John writes the same thing, and he seems to build upon that idea of light later in his first, second, and third epistles, but predominantly in his first one. He likes the idea of light and dark, and light is where Jesus is, because Jesus is the light of the world, who comes into the world to give light. Darkness is that which is not with Jesus, and the darkness has not overcome it. In other words, those who would not choose to follow God, follow Christ. And he talks about that people love the darkness more than the light. So John likes to make this contrast between those who are in the light and those who are not in the light, those who are with Jesus and following Jesus and those who are not following Jesus, which begs the question, prior to this moment, where was Nicodemus? If we use the terminologies of light and dark, where was Nicodemus? I have good news for you. You have a 50% chance of getting this question right. He's in the dark. Because earlier he'd come in the dark. Now I realize there may have been some historical reason as to why he comes into the dark, but John seems to take that historical reason and try and make a theological point. In part because he combines both Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who was a secret disciple. Perhaps if we were to separate the two, we could explain that Joseph was being secret for one of a variety of reasons, and maybe it doesn't mean exactly being secret. Perhaps we were talking about just Nicodemus, and we could say it was just a historical detail. But putting the two together, John seems to be trying to make a point that a secret disciple, not really a disciple, somebody who's still in the dark, because they haven't come out into the light. Because from John's perspective, to not be an open disciple is to not be a disciple at all. It's to still be in the dark. Which with Nicodemus, and it's interesting, John records Nicodemus not just once, not just twice, but actually 3 times. Once defending's too strong of a word. Once attempting to defend Jesus before the Sanhedrin, saying, "Man, should we really condemn somebody? Should we really condemn somebody without having all the witnesses and everything in place?" To which everyone else says, "Do you want to be his disciple?" Nicodemus shows up a couple times, and what John seems to be doing is showing us, okay, Nicodemus is in the dark. He's still in the dark, even though he's beginning to believe. He's still in the dark, and then at this moment, he comes into the light, because that which he professed internally becomes public knowledge, because he proclaims his following of Jesus by coming to get Jesus' body and take care of his body, just as Joseph of Arimathea does. From John's perspective, it is only when we make our belief in Jesus public knowledge that we truly enter the light. Until that moment, we remain in the dark, regardless of how much we choose to believe. Any thoughts or comments before we move on? Cool. It is clear as mud. All right, we're going to move on to John chapter 20. If I can get somebody to read verses 1 through 10. John chapter 20, verses 1 through 10.
Before we do that, I'd like to comment that this 75 pounds of myrrh and aloe, this is what you would use to bury a king.
Ah, okay. So there's some kind of statement being made.
Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter, the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciples, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen clothes laying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen clothes lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloth, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. And as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes.
All right, thank you. Well, we know this to be the beginning of the account of the resurrection. What is so important about the resurrection? Well, why is the resurrection such an important point to make note of?
It shows the power of God, obviously, to raise Christ back from the dead.
Okay, it shows the power of God. Yes, sir.
He had been telling his disciples all along that he was going to be crucified.
Okay.
And he had to do it. He had to show it, and he had to do it in a special way. And he blended in the old traditions with the new traditions at the same time with that linen cloth.
Okay, so it proves not only power, but it proves that Jesus knew what he was talking about and was able to fulfill what he talked about. Anything else? Yes, sir. Without it, we have no hope. Yes, at the cross, the sacrifice is made. However, new life doesn't begin until Jesus is raised from the dead, because otherwise he ends up being a liar. Because Jesus was pretty explicit that he was going to be raised from the dead. So much so that earlier in John, he calls himself the resurrection and the life. Well, if he's not raised from the dead, then how can he be life, and how can he give life to anybody else? Yes, sir?
Of those raised from the dead.
That he is the first fruits. Elsewhere he'll be called the new Adam, that there's a new creation. In fact, John begins his gospel pointing towards the idea of a new creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, talking about this, giving the aspects of new creation and hearkening back to Genesis to emphasize that a new creation was beginning through Jesus, which is culminated in his resurrection. Anything else? So when does the resurrection take place? Say again? It is the third day. What day is the third day? The third day is the first day. Huh. That's some funky math. The third is the first. Okay. The third day is the first day, and what is the third day that's the first day? That was a weird way to ask that question, wasn't it? What is the first day of the week? It's today, in case you didn't know. It's today. It's Sunday. It's why we get together every Sunday, to celebrate Jesus' resurrection, to celebrate the day that death dies, the day that victory becomes possible. It is the reason why we continue to get together and why throughout history Christians have gotten together to celebrate the magnificence of this particular day. It's interesting, we don't meet on the day Jesus crucified. As magnificent as that moment is, because the sacrifice is made, 3 days later, something even more magnificent takes place. So we meet on the day when life begins anew. The disciples, Mary, and interestingly, it's probably not just Mary herself. If we read all the gospel accounts, there seem to be at least 4 women at some point in time who show up with her. But they come and they recognize that something doesn't seem right. The stone has been rolled away and that Jesus isn't there. Now, I want to pause and ask the question, why was the stone rolled away? What do you think? Why is the stone rolled away?
So we could look in?
Yeah, so we can look in. It's not so Jesus can get out. Jesus does not need any help getting out. All we need to do is read just a little bit further in John, which we will in this particular chapter, and twice Jesus is going to pass through locked doors. He doesn't need anybody to roll a stone away from him. Go ahead.
If he was risen from the dead, but how would you verify it?
Right.
There's just somebody else walking around. Well, is it him? No, he's in the grave.
Right. So it's so that we can peek in. It's so that there could be some element of evidence associated. So his disciples can come and see that everything that takes place there is not for Jesus. It's for us. That Jesus goes out of his way to make sure that everyone could see for themselves that he wasn't there. Mary takes word back to the disciples because she's quite concerned. Where is his body? She's not sure what to think. Perhaps she thinks that maybe Joseph decided to move Jesus' body for whatever reason. Maybe a gardener came along. For whatever reason, she's not sure where it is, not sure what's taken place or what's happened. So she goes to the disciples and says, I'm not sure we went. Peter and John come running down, and the first one, well, I say John, it's a disciple whom Jesus loved, which John likes to refer to himself in that way. So Peter and John come running down. John stops, kind of pokes his head in. Peter, in his impetuousness and inevitable slowness, decides to continue to run back in, or decides to go ahead and run all the way in and look and see. As you look at the text, how many times does John see? How many times does the text say that John saw? Or the disciple, the other disciple, saw?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm curious about this common, or this habit of John calling himself the disciple that Jesus loved. That's occurred on a number of occasions. Any thoughts about that?
I don't know a definitive answer. My guess is his desire to be humble. And so he refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved rather than me and I. That's my guess. Do you anything else, Parks? I've never heard anything definitive. I've never seen anything that says this is why I do this. My guess is maybe just because he wants to be humble.
It is an indication of normal social relationships because, I've run into Christians over the years that decided that every Christian had to have the same relationship with every other Christian. On one occasion, a group of us had decided to get together to play cards, and we invited a member of the congregation to go with us, and she said, "Oh no, I could never be part of a clique." And that's not real. With Jesus, there are increasingly small circles of fellowship, and those increasingly small circles are increasingly intimate. You've got the 5,000 on the hillside. Then you have the 120, and out of the 120, you've got 12, and out of the 12, you have 3, Peter, James, and John, and out of the 3, you've got 1, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that's a normal way of fellowshipping each other. And to assume that to have a card party where every single member of the congregation hasn't been invited as a clique is not to understand what a clique is. In the Bible, a clique is a small group, a small, powerful group working against the interest of the rest of the group.
So regardless of why, at least we learn that particular aspect from the way he refers to himself. How many times does John say saw? Spoiler alert, it's twice. 3 times there's someone who saw. One of those is Peter. In between John is Peter. So scene seems to be this. John runs up, pauses, I'm going to say, puts his hand like this to stoop in. I don't know if he did or not. Somehow he stoops in. Why? I don't know. Commentators debate all over the place as to why he stooped in. I think it's a pointless discussion. Anyways, stoops in to look and see, and he sees. Along comes Peter, who runs in, and he sees. Okay, nothing special. But then the second time, John comes in and he sees, and what does the text say about this particular seeing? He saw and believed. He saw and believed. So what is it that he saw that led him to belief? What do you think he saw? What does the text say he saw?
The face covering folded up.
Okay, he sees that. What else does he see? He sees Jesus in there. Okay, what else does he see? Yes, the grave linens. And those two are important distinctions. Tell me, how are they described? Because they're described differently. How are the grave linens or the grave clothes described? And how is the face covering described? Okay, one is folded, the face covering's folded.
Face was folded in place. It came off his head. And I could go on, but I'll let you question more.
Okay? Now you said they took the grave clothes and threw them off to the side. Okay? How does the text refer to the grave clothes?
Strips.
That they're strips, yes? Strips, yep, they're strips. And how does it describe them? Lying there. Now, notice that lying there. Notice the difference. They're lying there versus they're folded. I think John's trying to describe something he's having trouble describing. For example, John does this at the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. How do you describe someone who is God but is secondary to God? You get the idea. Sometimes it's difficult to describe theological concepts, or you see something, it's like, I don't know how to put that into words. I think John's facing that conundrum here. The text doesn't say that those were lying on the ground. The text doesn't say that they were just kind of tossed. It says they were just lying there. Now, the reason why we are going to try and make some guesses is because what John sees leads him to believe. If he just saw stuff tossed to the side and thrown about and strewn about, what would his natural conclusion be? A grave robber came along. Somebody moved. Mary was right. Somebody's moved the body. But that's not what the text says. The text says that he believed. So there's something here that causes him to go, huh? Yes, sir.
The grave clothes to me kind of seems like when he woke back up or came back to life, they just dropped off the body. The head cloth, though, is folded, which implies intent.
Yeah. And this, I like that idea where you talked about it just kind of falls off. I'm a Star Wars fan. You guys know I'm a Star Wars fan. By far the best Star Wars movie is I can't say episode 3 anymore because it's an episode 3. Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. If you've watched Return of the Jedi, you'll remember that there's a scene with Yoda. And Yoda's going to die. If you haven't seen the movie, I'm sorry. You've had lots of time by now. You have no excuse. Yoda, when he dies, he vanishes. Do you remember what happens to the clothes that Yoda was wearing?
His garments just fall down.
They just kind of fall, right? Because there was something there, and then Yoda just disappears, and they just kind of fall. In a way that would be really hard to replicate, even if you were just toss it, because it would look like you tossed it. It'd be really hard to replicate that I was wearing it, and I was laying down, and I was there, and then all of a sudden I wasn't. I think that's what John's trying to describe. Because he says the grave clothes were just lying there. So in first century, the way that you go about burying someone, as you wrap them, some will refer to it as a single cloth, some will refer to it as strips of linens. It's just the grave clothes. You wrap them, but you wrap them not all the way up. You wrap them to about here, usually with their hands, something along these lines. And you wrap them all the way up to their shoulders, but you leave the shoulders, you leave the neck, and you leave the head exposed, and you put a secondary cloth like a turban that's wrapped around the head area, which means there's a space between the garments. John seems to be describing this space because he says one is separate from the other, and he says that one looks like it had just been on Jesus. It is just lying there, as if he's trying to describe that it looks as though Jesus was just in it. And how, because Jesus is like this, Jesus can't just get out without disturbing it, because it would be very obvious that someone who'd come out. If someone pulled them off of him in order to pull the body out, because it's very clear that these are the same grave clothes. They have blood on them. They know whose it is. It's not like they're clean. They know that these are the ones that were used. Well, to get the body out would mean having to open the grave clothes, but it doesn't look like that. It looks like they just kind of were on a body, and then now they're not on a body. But to make matters more complicated, they look at where the headrest is supposed to be, or the head garment is supposed to be, and it happens to be roughly the same distance that it should have been if it were on Jesus' head. but it's been folded. This almost incongruent picture of how would we explain Jesus' garment looking like he was just in it, while at the same time as his head portion looking like it was folded with a certain level of intent. And John seems to walk in and see this incongruent picture that he really can't explain, and he arrives at the conclusion that he must really have been raised because of the picture that is before him. Almost as though that the way the grave clothes are arranged is a miracle in and of itself. As though someone folded the cloth while at the same time allowing the grave clothes to just fall as if the body just vanished. Something that perhaps only God himself could manage to do. And it's this picture that moves John to believe. Any comments before we move on? Yes, sir.
I did the Lord's Supper about a month ago and talked about this. And I think the reason that they believed is when they saw the folded napkin. That was the point that they believed, because when the master of the household had a dinner or was eating, if he got up and just threw his napkin down and walked away, the servant standing off to the side would notice that and says, he's coming, he's done. But if the master folds the napkin and lays it down, it just says that he's returning. And when he saw that folded napkin, he realized then, because of tradition of man at that time, that Jesus was returning.
There is something about the way everything is arranged that moves John to belief, to arrive at the conclusion that Jesus must really have been raised. John seems to have realized that Jesus was raised. I'm not certain if Peter does or doesn't, because the text doesn't actually say Peter comes to belief. There is an explanation as to why John had to see, why he's just now recognizing, oh, what is that explanation? It comes right after he says he believed. Yeah, they still didn't understand. They still hadn't come to an understanding of everything Jesus had said. It seems that John believes at this point, but he's explaining why he had to go see more than one time, why he didn't understand at this particular point in time, why it's taken so long. But I'm not sure if Peter fully recognized it or not, because the text doesn't seem to say. But assuming that John does recognize, how do he and Peter react to that which they've seen? What do they do? They go home. And I don't really know why. And the text doesn't really tell us why. I can guess, but I don't know. They've just seen something that it seems like John is struggling to explain. It expresses that it was such an impactful moment that he comes to belief, and he believes that Jesus isn't there and that he's been raised, and he goes home. And I have no idea why. My guess is, what do you do when you just found out that someone has been raised from the dead? You go home and get a brain exam. That's what you do.
He's coming back then.
Okay, that perhaps he's coming back. Now, I don't know if John recognizes that yet. I don't know what all he recognizes. But I suspect that he's trying to wrestle with something that's never happened before, where a person was raised on their own. People have been raised from the dead before. Jesus raised people from the dead. Elijah raised people from the dead. But it was never somebody who just on their own seemingly was raised from the dead. That's never happened. So something that's never happened before, John now seems to be trying to wrestle with what has taken place and trying to get his mind wrapped around what has taken place. But for whatever reason, they go home. Any comments before we move on to the next section? Yes, ma'am.
I think that's where Jesus would look for them.
Okay,
At home.
maybe. Okay, so maybe that's what he goes to go do. We'll go here and then here.
it's interesting, I'm sorry if you already discussed this, he doesn't say what he believed.
That's true.
He just said, and it's John himself writing this, he basically is saying, I saw and I believed. What'd you believe, John? And in retrospect, we understand, but the readers at the time, I don't know, it seems like he would have spelled it out more.
Well, he is writing further into the future, when the idea of belief and what it means has developed a little bit more. So to say that he believed, I think they would have been able to understand what he meant. Now, does he understand anything and everything that we will come to understand as belief? That part I don't know, but he does seem to believe at least that Jesus has been raised from the dead, because he conveys the idea of belief.
Remember that when Jesus was crucified, the last thing he did was to assign responsibility for his mother to John, and John took her home with him. So at least one of the reasons for going home is to tell his mother the good news.
Okay, that might very well be it. They go home. Anything else before we move on? Yes.
Am I wrong? But wasn't there a guard guarding the tomb? And that suddenly is just not mentioned, seemed like.
Each gospel writer focuses on something else. So John doesn't focus on the same thing the synoptics do. In fact, John is very different than the synoptics. John seems to be focusing more upon Jesus's godhood than even does Matthew. Matthew does focus upon his godhood, but more of his authority and his kingship and his fulfillment that this is the Messiah. And so for Matthew, because he writes to Jews, emphasizing this is the Messiah, he refers to the guards who were there to make it clear. In fact, Matthew expresses that there was this rumor that circulated amongst the Jews that somebody had come and stolen his body. And so Matthew points to the guards as evidence that no, nobody stole the body. There were guards there. But they each write and focus on specific aspects of what Jesus does, because they're trying to make a specific point. Doesn't mean there weren't guards there. There were. At least at some point. Whether the guards are still there when the women arrived, that I don't know. But there were guards according to Matthew's account. But John is focusing on a different aspect. Anything else? All right. If I can get somebody to read verses 11 through 18.
Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He was asking her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascended to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her.
All right, thank you. What does it say about Jesus' appearance that Mary does not recognize him? Yes.
That he had in some way taken on a different look to him.
Okay. Remember, Mary is distraught. The text doesn't say that she's believed at this point. In fact, she seems not to have believed in comparison to Peter and John at the moment. she doesn't seem to have picked up on everything yet, because she's still expressing the garden. They've taken him away, and I don't know where they've laid, which doesn't seem to have wrapped her mind around it. So I don't know that she's expecting to see Jesus. She's distraught and crying, so it's probably a little harder to see. And remind me what time of day it is. It's super early in the morning. It's a little harder to see before it becomes really light. In fact, text emphasizes that she's come to the tomb when it was still dark. So it's still only beginning to become light. It's hard to see. So say again? Jesus isn't in the tomb at the moment. There are two angels who are there in the tomb, but it doesn't say that Jesus is still in the tomb. But one would assume no. So we can explain some of why she struggles to see, because, well, it's hard to see. Remember that Isaiah described Jesus as there being nothing particularly notable about him, that no beauty to draw us to him. There's nothing particularly notable. Seems to emphasize that reality. And why is that important? One, because it reminds us of Jesus. But two, Jesus has just risen from the dead. If ever there was a time to show up in bright, shining clothes, glowing like the sun, this would be it. And walk around proclaiming, see, I told you I was going to rise from the dead. Ha, ha, ha. Do you want to mock me now? If ever there was a time, this would be the time. But Jesus doesn't do that. He shows up looking as he has. Why? Because to Jesus, faith is the most important thing. At any point in time, he could have proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that he was God. Certainly, he could have done it at this point in time and showed up in his transfigured robes like he did during the transfiguration, glowing white, and everybody would cower in fear around him because he'd been raised from the dead and showed himself to be. But he doesn't do that. He shows up in a way that doesn't draw great attention to himself in order that faith might continue. There's another question we have to ask, though. Why did Jesus wait to show up? Why does Jesus show up to Mary? I'm not trying to disparage Mary. Why does he wait? Who was just there? Two of his disciples, and not just any two disciples. Who's there?
Two of the closest, the inner circle.
Two at the close to the inner circle and the closest. You remember the three that he takes with him to the transfiguration? Peter, James, and John. He's got 2/3 of that cohort. And he doesn't show up when they're there. Of all the times to show up so that they could spread the word quickly, that seems to have been the moment to show up so that Peter and John can see him. So we have to ask the question, why does Jesus wait? Okay? Okay.
Believe that or share that.
Okay. Maybe it's so one other person. All right, maybe. Why wait? Why does he wait until the disciples leave and show up to Mary? Good, I'm just as confused as you are. I have no idea. The text never tells us. But we have to wonder, why does Jesus wait? I'm sure he has his reason. Perhaps it's for that very reason. Perhaps it's so that later on, years, millennia later, as we read the gospel, we might be reminded of its accuracy, because Jesus should have shown up to his disciples if he wanted it to be considered the most accurate in that particular day. Instead, he shows up to Mary first, something that wouldn't have been expected if a story was just simply being made up. So maybe part of it was just simply to emphasize the truth of it, but we're not really told.
Is this Mary his mother, or is this Mary Magdalene?
Mary Magdalene. It's Mary Magdalene that he shows up to. Interesting, he also doesn't show up to his mother. I think it says Mary Magdalene right at the end. Verse 6. Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah. No. I assume because John wants to make it clear which Mary he's talking about. We're not told why Jesus chooses to reveal himself to Mary Magdalene before anybody else. But I do think there's at least one point we're to take away from it. And that is that we're to never underestimate the importance of women within the Bible and within Christianity. We talk about women's roles, and rightly so, because it's part of what what God has told us to do, part of the great counsel of God. But in the midst of those discussions, we shouldn't somehow arrive at the conclusion or somehow convey that women aren't important, because the Bible makes it very clear that women are essential. In this case, it is Mary Magdalene who sees Jesus before anybody else, even before his disciples. It's Mary Magdalene who's tasked with getting all the disciples together and making sure they're all in one place for Jesus to show up to. But throughout Scripture, we see women playing a vital role within, not only within bringing about God's will, but in playing his will, and within Christianity, that women have always played an important and essential role. We should never downplay it.
I don't know if this is true, I'm just asking, in the social status of things, would Mary Magdalene be the lowest of the Marys?
We understand her to be one of the seven demons. If that's the case, yes. Mary Magdalene, if I recall, means the woman from Magdala, which is just a little small kind of area. I don't know whether she would be considered of lower social standing than Mary, Jesus' mother, simply because Mary, Jesus' mother, is a widow. I don't know.
Okay.
But she would have been considered a lower social standing. Though it does appear that she has some money, because Luke suggests that she helps pay for the disciples' stuff. So I'm not entirely sure. Any other comments before we move on? Oh, never mind. We're going to wrap up there because I have 1 minute, don't I? Oh, 2 minutes. Okay. Anybody want the last word? Two of you want the last word. You each have a minute each.
Could it be that he showed himself to her because the officials at that time would probably not have given her enough credit to produce something like that?
I do. That's at least one of the results of it. Whether that was the reason or not, I don't know. But at least one of the results of it is, at that particular point in time, the testimony of a woman was considered worth absolutely nothing. So you shouldn't show up. If you wanted to make up a story, you wouldn't say that you showed up to a woman was the person deceived. It emphasizes the truthness of the story, and that it was, and that it presents something that you wouldn't have wanted to make up. Yes, ma'am.
Time for Mary, and he was telling her to be calm. I don't know if that's significant or not, because he told her not to cling to me. So a very emotional state for her, grieving, and then shock of him coming back.
Okay. It is a very emotional time. 2.5 seconds.
Interesting that she doesn't recognize him until he says her name and makes it personal. And I think that is like a really interesting point, that, she's so distraught, but when he says Mary, she recognized.
Interesting that she recognized him by his voice. All right, we'll pray, and then we'll wrap up for today. Heavenly Father, Lord, we're so thankful for your Son. So thankful for your word, that we might know about him and come to know you. Lord, we ask that you help us to glorify you in all we do. We love and thank you.